I want to welcome everybody to this memorial symposium for Nancypetry. We might have a few wet eyes in here today, but it's, such a huge loss to our field to have somebody as wonderful, productive, and creative as Nancy, to have her brilliant career cut off at the knees by a terrible disease. But it is what it is, and so we're here to honor her memory and to honor her work. And the way we're going to do that is with a traditional symposium that has 4 different talks in it and 2 chairs, me and Kathy Carroll. So without any more ado right now, I want to introduce our first speaker, who's Warren Bickel, who's going to talk about Nancy's early contributions to delayed discounting and behavioral economics.
Although I'm affiliated with these companies, I will not be mentioning them or their products. What I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about Nancy. I would like to review some of her seminal contributions to the study of delayed discounting. And I'd like to then briefly review the contemporary status of that work that she was instrumental in starting. So this is a picture of Nancy when she was in my lab, about that time. I had the great honor of serving on her dissertation committee at Harvard. She was doing research on alcohol self-administration in rats. And then she came to work in my lab to deal with opiate-dependent heroin addicts, right? And be involved with their clinical treatment. I found an old letter of recommendation for her, and as I look back on it, it's appropriate today. I wrote, "Every once in a while, those of us involved in training of a young scientist are lucky enough to have a wunderkind as a trainee." Nancypetry is a wunderkind. I was fortunate to have her work on my projects. As a postdoc, Nancy ran the day-to-day operation of my research clinic for examining buprenorphine as a treatment for opioid dependence. She was a phenomenon. Almost immediately, she mastered the complex position, including subject recruitment, subject screening, study assignment, informed consent, coordinating staff, overseeing compliance with protocols, contacting the IRB regarding new protocols, and reporting developments. After mastering these tasks, she got busy. She caused almost an explosion of research. She distinguished herself by being an author on 16 publications based on her postdoctoral training of mere 2 years. Many of these papers are wonderful examples of innovative research addressing important issues of substance abuse. I'm going to talk about delayed discounting, but when Nancy was with us, working in my lab, we did work on buprenorphine in its development. We did work on neurological models of addiction. We did work on a variety of things, including something that presaged one of her important contributions. She came in, she said, the opiate-dependent people just talk in a way in the clinic that makes everyone feel bad. They're cursing and making these noises. So she said, I have an idea. Why don't we put up a fishbowl? And if they are speaking appropriately, they can withdraw from it. Well, that became a paper in 1998. It published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, doing an ABA design in our research clinic. Of course, she then took the fishbowl south to Connecticut. But I'm not going to talk about that. I want to talk to you about her contributions to delayed discounting, and that starts with a little story. So, in 1996, in a brew pub in Burlington, Vermont, I had the great fortune of being surrounded by some really smart people: Greg Madden, of course Nancy, and John Roll. And we were also surrounded by beer. And while we were there, we were reading outside of our research area. We read this book, Economic Choice Theory, an experimental analysis of animal behavior. And in there, they were talking about this thing, delayed discounting. And we said, that sounds interesting. Why don't we do a study on it? Just for those who are not familiar with delayed discounting, I'm just going to go through the procedures very quickly so you just have a sense. It refers to reduction of value of reinforcer as a function of delay to reinforcer delivery. Everyone probably discounts to some extent, and if I were to ask anyone here, what would you prefer, $1,000 now or $1,000 a year from now? I know what most of you would say, like, I'm in San Antonio, what are you talking about? I could use $1,000 right now. And if you would say that, that means you discount the later $1,000, but we don't know by how much. And we could figure out how much by doing a psychophysical titration procedure where we vary the amount now and see when you switch your preference from the immediate option to the delayed one. So, for example, we say, what about, would you prefer $950 now or $1,000, let's say a month from now, right? $900 now, $1,000 a month. If you switch your preference when we reach $800, we can infer that you discount $1,000 by 20%. If we do it at a variety of time frames, 1 month, 6 months, a year, we construct a curve. That curve has a particular quantitative shape that's well characterized by this equation. Developed by measure where the value of a reinforcer equals the amount of reinforcer divided by the sum of 1 plus the discount rate multiplied by the delay. To make this concrete to you, if I want to increase the value of something, I would do it by increasing the amount or decreasing the delay, or if I could intervene on it directly, change the discount rate. When we do this equation, we solve it for K, and that is our measure of discounting. So this is the first study that we did together, Greg Madden, Nancypetry, and myself, along with our statistician, Gary Badger. And we're looking at the discounting of opiate-dependent people versus match-controlled participants, matched on IQ, gender, and socioeconomic status. And the way to interpret this, each of those data points, if people are switching their preference from the immediate to the delayed option, is there like a pointer? Or not? Or not? So you're going to have to trust me on a couple of things. So the closer they hug the axis, the greater the discounting. But just to give us a sense of the magnitude, how much more discounting is there? One way we can quantitate these curves is half-life. And so how long does it take for this hypothetical $1,000 to lose half its value, right? So for the upper panel, which is the controls, it's right around a little bit under the 2,000 days. That is the 6-month time. That's the 5-year time point. And you see the data point for the opiate-dependent people in the upper panel, between 40 and 60. It's almost right on at the 50% mark. That's the 6-month time frame. That is a 10-fold difference, 10 times. We then asked the heroin-dependent people also how much would they discount $1,000 worth of heroin. So we brought down their money curve to the lower panel. And at the shortest time frame examined, 1 week, it never got to 50%. There was no amount of heroin available today that was worth any amount of heroin tomorrow, meaning there was a greater than a 25-fold difference in how much they discounted heroin compared to how much they discount money. Or if we're comparing the discounting of heroin by heroin addicts to a comparable amount of money by controls, we're up in the 250-fold range. When you contact some information like that in science, you say, this might be interesting. This might be important. Nancy also was very interested, and she found this old measure of how people value the future. And it was almost like you fill in the back end of a story. And the story goes, you're thinking about the future, you think, and we're not concerned with the content. What's the time frame? We also did it in controls and heroin addicts. The controls referred to a future of 4.7 years. The heroin addicts, on average, referred to a future of 9 days. Right? That is like amazing. And it becomes a window to understand addiction, and Nancy knew this very well, right? If you're only worried on average on the next 9 days, what kind of mischief can you get into? Because you're not worried about what happens after that. You can share a needle someone else just used. You can do all kinds of things. Then Nancy brought in a colleague of hers, Chris Kirby, and we generated another paper out of our research clinic on this topic, which is a very nice paper using the Kirby discounting task. I'm not going to go into that in great detail. It kind of replicates what we showed previously. Nancy was a very productive scientist. According to Web of Science, she published 368 papers. Of her 10 most cited papers, 7 were about discounting, which tells you about the importance of her work in this area. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of her studies, then quickly summarize what the current status of our understanding of this is. This is a very nice study she did when she was in Connecticut in psychopharmacology. She looked at Controls, recently abstinent alcohol-dependent folks and alcohol-dependent individuals, discounting a hypothetical $1,000 and a hypothetical $100. And what you see is that abstinent individuals, the beginning of their abstinence is in between people who are currently alcohol-dependent and people who are controls, suggesting, and I think this is an important observation, that this discounting thing may be tracking people in recovery. That's interesting. And here she started her work in gamblers, and she has a whole career on gambling, but she did this paper where she looked at controls, gamblers, and gamblers with substance use. And as you have greater, you're a gambler, you discount more than controls, but if you also have substance use, you discount more than just plain gamblers, suggesting that these different disorders may be additive. This is a very another interesting observation. So let me just quickly talk about the contemporary status. So first, we might say, well, discounting, there are probably many measures that are very useful. Why is discounting so relevant? Well, I think Nancy and Greg and I had a good idea, because let me show you some data. Here we have a whole bunch of different measures in alcohol-dependent folks, stimulant-dependent folks, and normals. And pretty much if you're drug-dependent, you do pretty bad on most things, right? That's using standard statistical methods. But what happens if you use some other quantitative means, such as machine learning or iterated binary assortment, classification tree? When you do that, what you find is in this tree, what it does is it looks at all the measures and says, what's the best measure in predicting whether someone's alcohol or control or stimulant dependent or control? And then what's the next best two items, next best four, and it creates a tree, right? In this tree that correctly allocates 90% of the sample, discounting comes in first and can correctly allocate 75% of the individuals. All the other measures contribute 15%. That was true roughly for the same numbers for the alcohol-dependent folks and the stimulant-dependent folks. Discounting has been shown to be a trans-disease process operative in every form of addiction except maybe marijuana dependence, and I think it's a smaller effect there, so you probably need a bigger sample to detect it. Problem gambling, if you're obese, you discount more if you're not obese. You discount more from a low socioeconomic status background. A nice study from the CDC, 1,000 young adults, and if they discount a lot, they engage in risky sexual practices, and they were looking at monetary discounting. We showed that individuals that, among the heroin addicts, if they shared needles, they discounted even more. There are a whole bunch of health behaviors are associated with excessive discounting in the future. And I like to believe in the symmetry of science, and there's even problems if you discount the future too little. Anorexia is a wonderful one, right? So you can ignore the biological signals of starvation to achieve a future goal. That's pretty interesting. We've also suggested it should be a candidate behavioral marker of addiction. It predicts who will later use substances in longitudinal studies. Discounting is proportional to drug use. It can distinguish drug dependent from controls or recovery, as I showed you with Nancy's data with alcohol abstinent individuals. If you measure it at baseline, it's predictive of therapeutic success. And what we've been focused in my work recently is, can it be changed therapeutically? Recently, in 2007, there was a wonderful paper in Science talking about the new science of human prospection. How do people think about the future, by Wilson and Gilbert from Harvard University. Out of that work comes the notion of episodic future thinking. In episodic future thinking, you get people to concretely visualize several future events. Tell me something's going to happen to you a week from now. What do you see, hear, feel, think, smell? Give me a title for it. Might be like my nephew's birthday party. It could be any number of things, right? Let's do 1 month. Let's do 3 months. Let's do 6 months. And then we take the titles and we expose them to them while they do discounting and various measures. In our first study in this regard, and what we're doing here is applying an approach that I like to think about that's very useful, an experimental medicine approach, right? Identify and develop an assay of an intervention targeted to play a role in addiction, right? So we think discounting might be one of those things. Can we engage the target through an intervention? Well, we're going to do that with episodic future thinking, and we want to test whether it not only changes the discounting, but does it have an impact on other aspects of the disorder. If it doesn't, who cares? If it does, that might tell us that it's more important to the nature of the understanding of the disorder. So let's see what episodic future thinking does. On the left-hand panel, we look at cigarette smokers, who receive either episodic future thinking, EFT, or the control episodic thinking task. And the discounting is now on a log scale, so the shape looks a little bit different. But the way to interpret this, if it's one's above the other, they're valuing the future more, and episodic future thinking gets them to value the future more. We then recorded these people talking about the episodic future events. We'd cigarette deprived them for 6 hours. We put them in a room where they had free access to cigarettes, but we pumped in the recordings of them talking about the episodic future events or the control events, and they smoked significantly less. We did something comparable with alcohol-dependent folks. We got them to do episodic future thinking, got them to value the future more, and then we asked them how much alcohol they would consume for their consumption alone over 24 hours at different prices, a demand curve, and we shifted down how much they value alcohol. Obese individuals, we got them to value the future more with episodic future thinking, and then we asked them about their favorite obesogenic food, and we shifted down how much they value that. I can also tell you, but I don't have time to go into it, we have interventions that can shorten up the temporal view, and when we do, it drives up valuation of the substances. So I think discounting is a novel determinant of addiction, and it stems from the work that Nancy and others started in Vermont a long time ago. We recently reviewed recent neurobehavioral theories of decision-making in addiction. What is our understanding of it? And except for some of our writing, no contemporary theory of addiction addresses delayed discounting as a determinant. So just quickly to summarize, Nancy was a productive and innovative researcher. She made important seminal contributions to delayed discounting. Those contributions set the stage for subsequent research, and because of that, we can now consider discounting, I believe, a determinant of substance valuation. Nancy, I consider a friend of mine, a really productive researcher, and I think the reason we all miss her so much is because she was such a remarkable person. Thank you.
Maxine and I are debating whether there should be questions. Do we have questions?
We can move on.
We'll just pull it. Okay. I don't think this is working. And next we'll hear from Nancy's friend and colleague, Dr. John Roll from Washington State University in Spokane. We'll talk about Nancy's work on refining CM for use in non-academic clinical settings. Thanks, John.
Oh, and you know what? I think it's better if this kind of gets put kind of like that.
Okay, can you hear me there? Thanks. And Curtis, thanks for all your help with my slides today. The notes will be coming up here, I guess. There we go. Thank you, Curtis. And it makes me, Warren's talk, great talk, makes me want to say thanks to Stephen Warren. Well, I'm going to get the red buzzer if I don't pull it together, so I better move along. Thanks to Stephen Warren for making engineering such a cool, great place in the late 90s in Vermont. Thanks. All right, so, shoot. Thought I had it under control. I'm sorry.
What, do we not have a technical, there's nobody back there?
No, it's all good. I'm the guy who's, it's not the slides, it's me.
What did you do?
Well, I'm kind of choking up. I'm sorry. I know I'm not very effective. This is sad, John, Maxine. So. Okay, I've got it. But thanks. I think we got it now. So, it's kind of a hard talk to figure out how to do. I wasn't sure how to play it. One of your closest friends, a legacy, her contributions. So I hope I've hit the mark here today. So my task is to talk about refining contingency management for use in non-academic clinical settings. And how do I advance it with this? Okay, here we go. Before I do that, I want to tell you about when I first met Nancy. As Warren alluded, I was a brand new postdoc at Vermont. And, God damn it. Embarrassing myself here, sorry.
It's okay. We all feel
That's
it.
why we're here. That's why we're here.
I was feeling a bit like a fish out of water, to be honest. Let me park that thing.
And have some water. Want some water?
I was feeling a little bit like a fish out of water, kind of missing the sound of pigeons tapping away in my operant chambers and the smell of cedar shavings. And Nancy and I had both come from similar backgrounds, both being trained by students of Herrnstein and Skinner in basic operant pharmacology, behavioral pharmacology. And early on, there was a seminar series that Steve and Warren had put together. And I remember walking in, and Nancy gave a talk based on this paper she had just published with Gene Heyman, the effects of qualitatively different reinforcers on the parameters of the response strength equation. Those were words I knew, and all of a sudden I felt like maybe things were going to be okay there. And shortly thereafter, Nancy and I became closest of friends. In fact, I should say, any pictures I have predate cell phones. If they had cell phones then, certainly neither Nancy or I could have afforded one. So these are going to be old school photos. Not only did I become a good friend with Nancy, my fiance at the time, Dr. Chapman, did, and a few years later, Nancy joined us as Marianne's maid of honor at our wedding here in Vermont. And we were able to reciprocate by going to Nancy's wedding. I already knew Maxine was a good dancer, but I remember at that wedding thinking, well, Kathy Carroll can really dance too. So had a lot of fun. Warren stole my thunder a little bit, unintentionally, I know, but I wanted to talk about the first real foray Nancy made into this clinical area of fish bowls, if you will. And Warren talked a little bit about this study, a behavioral intervention for improving verbal behaviors of heroin addicts in a treatment clinic. So Nancy was running Warren's treatment clinic, and I think it was primarily just methadone, maybe a little lamb, I don't remember, but they were trying to bring buprenorphine on board. And Nancy was offended, apparently, by the cursing of the heroin addicts in the clinic, which is a little surprising if you know Nancy, because she, in fact, did know most of the swear words and knew how to use them appropriately. But somehow this offended her. So she started a project with Warren, a good AB type design, being a good Skinnerian. And how it worked was that she and her colleagues would walk through the clinic areas, and every time they'd catch a heroin addict and doing something good, they'd slap a sticker on him that said, good job, or wow, or it was a train or something. I got lots of stickers stuck to me at this time, I remember. It's pure Nancy. She loved doing stuff like that. But every time you got a sticker, you could be entered into a drawing for $25, and hence the fishbowl was born. Here's some data from that. These are different geographic locations of the clinic. You can maybe just look at that bottom panel there. On the far left, you've got cursing before the stickers, then the stickers come, cursing goes down. Take those stickers away, cursing comes right back up, put them back, and there goes cursing. And to my knowledge, that clinic has still got a bunch of docile people sitting around not swearing. So this really, as I say, led the way for her work on prizes, fish bowls. What should we call it? Is it motivational incentives? Is it fishbowl? Is it prize-based? What you might not know is it was very nearly called garbage can contingency management. There was a protocol she was working on with Walter Ling and a couple others at UCLA, and Walter had a garbage can with a little swinging lid and had the clients reaching in there to draw the chits out, but the UCLA IRB, and something that of course was not IRB overreach, determined that that was stigmatizing to drug addicts to have them reaching their hands into garbage cans. So never became garbage can Sam. Steve Higgins and Ken Silverman and I published a paper where we corrected Nancy and told her it's really called variable magnitude of reinforcement procedure, because that's actually what it is. It varies the magnitude of reinforcement by behavior. Nancy grudgingly accepted this, but honestly, she really didn't care at all what you called it. She just cared that you did it right. She could have cared less what it was called. And her very first study into that, her first significant study into that, was done in the VA setting, an intermittent incentive study with alcoholics, and these are Nancy's actual slides here I'm going to use. She enrolled alcohol-dependent outpatients. Everybody received standard treatment, which was intensive outpatient day programming for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for 4 weeks, followed by 4 more weeks of aftercare, which consisted of 1 to 3 groups per week for the next 4 weeks. Treatment consisted of group sessions, 12-step, relapse prevention, vocational rehabilitation, AIDS education, and coping skills training. The control group received standard group treatment and breath alcohol monitoring daily during intensive weekly during aftercare, and an additional 15 minutes of education on alcohol abuse as an attentional control. I got to pause and say something about Nancy's slides. Nancy loved her clip art. I don't even know if they still have clip art, but she loved clip art. And you're going to see a lot of clip art. I've left it in there today as a nod to her. Whenever Nancy and I would do a talk together, she'd put in a bunch of clip art and I would take it out, and it always ended up in there at the end of the day. So Nancy's clip art. The contingency group here received the same thing that I've just described, but they received incentives for alcohol abstinence. 1 draw for each negative breath alcohol test and 5 draws for a week of consecutive abstinences. Now, when you got those draws, half of the cards you could draw were winning. They gave you a prize. The others just said, good job. And here's what the prizes were. Half had a chance of winning a small $1 prize, 1/16 of winning a $20 prize, and 1 of 100. Here's what she found. You can see, I'm sorry, I feel this side's being neglected. The words are down there, so I'm sorry. But you don't need words for a slide like this. The purple are the contingency management conditions, and the green is the standard condition. You can see that retention was significantly better in the CM intervention. This is time until first drinking episode. Again, you can see that those in the contingency group, the fishbowl group, were more likely to remain abstinent. Something that people are still following up on today, I know people in our group are following up on this. At intake, those in the contingency group were more likely than the control group to provide a urine or a drug test positive for an illicit drug. But when you damp down the alcohol use with the CM intervention, you saw a concurrent dampening down of illicit drug use. So it had effects on other types of drugs. Here's how Nancy summarized this. The intermittent schedule of reinforcement significantly increased retention and reduced alcohol as well as other drug use. On average, these subjects earned about $200 worth of prizes, which was important because Nancy was trying to drive the cost of CM interventions down. This paper has been cited almost 500 times, and the papers that cite it have been cited almost 20,000 times. So you can see it was quite an effective and profound impact. And it led the stage for another really fun time in our careers. This was the CTN 006 and 007 protocols that Maxine was the PI on, but Nancy and Jessica Pierce were
Okay, yeah, I guess so.
PI, co-PI. Nancy and Jessica and Maxine were all a big part of this. I got to be part of it. Betty, of course, there in the audience was part of it. It was a great time. Here's a picture of Nancy at CPDD in Arizona about the time we were doing these studies. Here, I won't go into any detail on this, but this is the first one. Jessica Pierce was the lead author on. This is from the Archives of General Psychiatry, enrolled 388 participants. And you can see in the far right-hand panel there that participants were about 2 times more likely to be abstinent in the contingency management group than in the control group. And on average, it cost $120 per participant to get this abstinence in prizes. The next one, Nancy was the lead author on in Archives of General Psychiatry, enrolled 415 participants. On average here, it cost $203 per participant for the prizes. Both of these studies have been cited about 650 times, and those studies have been cited 16,000 times. So that's pretty good. This really set the stage, in my mind, for the widespread dissemination of Nancy's work, but there were and there still are some significant barriers. One of those is the limited funding for CM-associated urine testing and reinforcers, limited provider knowledge and understanding of contingency management, a lack of practical implementation tools, scarcity of externally valid implementation strategies. All of these continue to be issues we need to address. Kim Kirby and Lois Beneshek first really outlined this list in a 2006 publication. Our group, Duni Uluwoye in our group, and Carl, I think Carl's out in the audience here somewhere, have a paper in press called The Dissemination and Implementation of Contingency Management for Substance Use Disorders, a systematic review. They used their preferred reporting items for systemic reviews and meta-analysis, PRISMA, and identified 107 studies, which they reduced to 24. They focused first on dissemination, which is, according to NIDA, or NIH rather, a targeted distribution of information and intervention materials to a specific public health or clinical practice audience. Nancy is legion in this area. As Warren said, she's published so many papers, and so many of them really directly address this issue. She's also worked with Maxine and others on producing things with the blending products out of CTN, the PAMI products, computer-assisted products. If you go online and Google her, you can find videos of her describing how to do this all over the world. And she's written books and chapters and papers galore. Where I think Nancy's work really comes to the fore, though, is in implementation. NIH defines that as strategies to adopt and integrate evidence-based interventions into clinical and community settings. In this paper, we identify 3 key aspects of Nancy's work. The first was fidelity. Earlier, I said she didn't care what you called it as long as you did it right. She was serious about that. And she developed, sorry, I was having my little fit earlier. I messed up the mic there. She developed scales to assess fidelity. She developed other ways that we can go in and measure fidelity. She was also incredibly collaborative. In the old days, when Nancy was going to start a trial, she would never dream of starting that trial without first going into the clinic, working with the clinicians who'd be delivering the intervention, working with the clinical supervisors, working with the business office, even working with the person who's at the reception desk, and if she could, meeting face-to-face with patients and their families. She really wanted to, while remaining high with regards to fidelity, make sure that the treatment fit the clinical goals in the clinical setting in which she was doing it. And she was very consultative. She was not a helicopter researcher who popped in and out of these settings. She would go in, get it set up, and then you were stuck with her and her team, maybe forever, because she always wanted to be there, to be a consultation, a resource for those people who partnered with her, to continue to ensure fidelity was good, to troubleshoot, and to help them be successful. I think had Nancy lived, she would have really been all over the de-implementation literature. This idea that we need to start ramping down treatments that aren't as effective as those that are effective. I know Nancy would have thought that as you're removing something, you need to put something else in. And what better to bring in than a contingent type intervention that can fill voids and we know has some success. So I think this is an area where her legacy can have a further impact. I thought it would be fun, just a few slides here. These are, again, Nancy's slides. So if you were with her, she would go into a clinic, and these are the actual slides, a small sample of the actual slides she would have used. She made these, but then she and Maxine and others tailored these a little bit in the CTN. So I'm not sure who made these final ones, but I think Nancy was kind of the pusher on this. She'd start off by this. It's the contingency, really forcing people to think about the contingency. It's a contingent relationship. She loved this spinning cup. She was so proud of that. But she'd talk about rewards and punishments. You got to think, so Nancy's about this tall, a diminutive small person, and she's coming in with these kind of cute slides with spinning trophies, very non-threatening. This is somebody that anybody can say, well, I can have a relationship with her. It's not going to be scary. And that was part of her charm. She would talk about how rewards shape behavior in everyday life. Going through those areas, I can actually hear her giving this talk. It's kind of, I've heard it so many times. Similarly with punishers, things we all know, but she was building her audience up. She would talk about reward versus punishment, how both can change behavior, but most people prefer reward. She'd go into punishment quite a bit, talking about tendencies to escape the punisher, but those weren't words she would use. She would say it more like this. She would talk about how rewards teach new behaviors and promote growth, promote self-esteem and self-confidence, promote positive atmospheres and communication. she would always pause on that last point and talk about how substance use treatment is often a fairly negative set of interactions. You are working with a patient or their family talking about something the patient has done wrong. Contingency management gives you a chance to celebrate a success. And then she would talk about how that can promote an enhanced therapeutic relationship, a therapeutic alliance. And I think that the role of the therapeutic alliance is something we still don't probably understand well enough in successful addiction treatment. She would talk about how incentives could be used in substance abuse treatment, convincing people that they already are, take-homes, award ceremonies, key change status recognition. She loved to tell clinicians that one of the most powerful punishers they had at their disposal was to threaten their clients with extra time with them, extra counseling time. And then she'd go into how can incentives work for you? Patient attends treatment, provides a negative sample, you give an incentive, more patients attend and stay clean. She would go into these 3 principles in some detail: frequently monitoring behavior, providing incentives when target behavior occur, removing incentives when target behaviors don't occur. And then she would talk about 3 research studies. I never saw Nancy talk in a clinical setting about contingency management where she didn't mention these 3 studies. She'd start with Steve's seminal study, which I think really set the stage for the tremendous reception contingency management has had in the scientific community. I won't go into these. I think we know those. And then she would shift into Ken Silverman's follow-on study that really further established the role of the contingent relationship with the vouchers. And then primarily as a nod to me, I guess, she would have a study that Steve and I did showing that escalating magnitudes of vouchers are important to engender continuous abstinence. So how do we continue her work in disseminating these interventions? I think this is where Nancy's genius really comes to the fore. She had a genuine empathy for those who were struggling to engage with a recovery lifestyle and for those who were trying to help them. I wrote in her obituary for the American Psychologist, and I mean it sincerely, she cared a great deal more about helping a single person recover from a life of addiction than she did about any personal glory or academic accolade. I'll give you one story about that. One day, she and I were at a clinic in downtown Los Angeles. I don't remember the details, but I remember the story. It was a hot day, like all summer days in LA are. There were some mid-level dignitaries. I hope nobody in the audience was one of them. I didn't mean to insult you if you were, but they were mid-level dignitaries taking us around. It was a clinic that specialized in treating HIV, addiction, and mental health. We were going on this tour, and this profoundly ill woman broke kind of through this phalanx around us and came up and started talking. And Nancy insisted that we sit down with that lady and talk to her about her experiences there for a good 15 minutes while the dignitaries were looking at their watches and standing on the sideline. And I think that kind of reflects Nancy. Since her death, I've had a chance to read some of her work again, and some of it for the first time, and I wouldn't even suggest that I could ever read all of it. But I've found that her truest voice, the one that I know, comes through best in the dedications in some of her books. So I'm going to wrap up with that. There's 3 books I want to talk about. One, I know Dave's going to talk about her work in gambling. I think it might be worth noting that her work in gambling is in part influenced by early comparisons of the fishbowl to a lottery. And that piqued her curiosity there. In this book, she talks very lovingly about the guy who's going to become her husband, Dr. William White. She dedicates it to a number of people, including my son, Marshall, sitting here, who was born when she was writing that book. I don't know if everybody on the podium with me today knows it, but every single one of us are thanked by name in the dedication to this book, and many of you in the audience. And this new book that just came out, Nancy Was Everywhere, Pause and Reset, A Parent's Guide to Preventing and Overcoming Problems with Gaming, she had this to say. I'll let you read it. And I think it's these last words about real-life relationships and activities are what Nancy would want me to leave you with today. It's, I believe, the secret of her great success in translating science into practice. The answer to the question about how we keep disseminating CM in science, Nancy was always an N of one kind of scientist. If the one was the one you were talking to, that's the most important person. She wanted to understand and empathize with the person seeking treatment and the person trying to help them. This gave her a unique entree into their world, and they trusted her and let her help them succeed. The best way I can think of for us to honor her legacy is to keep in mind her advice about real-life relationships and activities. As she said, they are irreplaceable. Thank you.
Whoa. That was, John, thank you so much. That was pretty amazing. Reminding us, I didn't remember that all that clip art came from Nancy, and I used it for years. I thought maybe I had found it, I don't know, but now I know, now I remember. She was brilliant at talking to clinicians, absolutely brilliant. She had that effervescent personality that made it sound like doing contingency management was the most natural and fun thing you could possibly think of doing. And, clinicians don't think in that way, but she was able to convey that. She was a joy. She was. Okay. So, our next talk is, we're carrying on in the theme of dissemination, because Carla Rash, of course, has been a colleague of Nancy's at University of Connecticut for many years, and so in some ways she's going to be carrying on the legacy at that particular institution, and she's going to talk about dissemination of CM in clinical practice.
I'm so happy that I get to talk a little bit more about dissemination, because I think it was very near and dear to Nancy, particularly the VA experience, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment. I should say some of those black and white photos that you saw in the previous two slides, that's what Nancy looked like when I met her, even though it was a little further down the line. And you have to imagine my shock when she picked me up from the airport as a postdoc interviewee, and I had done my research, looked up these plethora of publications that she had. I saw that she was a full professor and had been at UConn for a while. And then when I meet her, she looks not that much older than myself. It was an absolute shock, but she was tremendously successful. She promoted to full professor, I think it was in 6 years, something pretty amazing. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that Nancy and our lab has done to establish CM's generalizability. We've done a lot of work in that area, and then I'll talk about 2 examples of CM implementation efforts that serve as good models for moving forward. And then I'll end with talking about how rewards or incentives are actually used clinically outside of research. We've talked about her fishbowl approach. That's just a picture of our prize bowl and cabinet. We actually keep the cabinets in the clinicians' offices, so that as soon as the patient draws a prize, they can turn to the cabinet and select the prize that they're going to take home with them. All right, so let's talk about the generalizability of CM. We've done a lot of work in this, and this is where I came into Nancy's lab as a postdoc. I was interested in finding the subgroups that CM may be more robust or less robust for, with the idea of steering somewhat limited resources toward the biggest benefit. So we've looked at a lot of demographic characteristics and a lot of clinical characteristics that often serve as proxies for severity. And a lot of these, adopting Nancy's approach, a lot of these came directly from clinicians. These were questions that clinicians were asking me when I went out to talk to them and when we were doing trainings in the community with these clinics. They would ask us, well, our patients are a little more well off financially. Are they really going to respond to these $1 prizes? So we looked at it. Another question was, well, if they're already in abstinent contingent housing settings, are these fishbowl approaches really going to do any anything additional above and beyond. So we looked at these questions. We looked at a lot of different things. And the takeaway from all of this literature is that CM generalizes widely. There are a few exceptions, one of which I'll bring your attention to, and that is how patients present to treatment. So whether they're presenting with ongoing current use, so their UTOX is positive or negative. There's some mixed results there. I think it still remains to be seen what direction to go in with respect to that. But one study I'll point you to is her 2012 study. It was a very large randomized clinical trial with 2 arms. One arm was for those presenting to treatment drug positive, and the other arm was for those who were presenting to treatment drug negative. It's not that CM doesn't work for individuals presenting drug positive, but from her study, it suggests that they may need a higher magnitude to get the same benefit. Nancy and many others have gone on to establish that CM works for drug abstinence across a range of different substances, moving beyond stimulants into many others. And Nancy and others have established alternate behaviors as ideal targets or good targets for CM interventions. Treatment attendance is a big one. Nancy did a lot of work in medication adherence for blood pressure medication, HIV medication, and so on. She also did some work reinforcing exercise behaviors and physical activity, and then also work in reinforcing treatment-related goal activity completion. So out of that has come a line of research reinforcing job-seeking behaviors, because that is an issue that many individuals in substance abuse treatment face. In relation to CM's applicability widely, a lot of work has been done to establish that CM matches well on pretty much any platform therapy out there. The 2 most common would be probably IOP and methadone settings, of which Nancy did a lot of that work, but also community reinforcement approach has been paired with CM a lot as well. There are many, many others. I only listed some here, but I think the message is that CM will work with just about anything. I haven't seen anything that it doesn't work with well yet. Despite CM's efficacy and what we know about its generalizability, it's the least likely to be implemented clinically, and that is concerning. And that Nancy addressed directly, and Dr. Roll talked about some of those initial studies that she did to push CM forward in this area. I'm going to talk about a few more. These were the training therapist studies. Nancy went out into the clinics. There were 2 publications, one in IOP settings and another in methadone settings. She went out into these clinics, trained clinicians to implement CM, supervised them for a short period, and then let them go on their own. And we were concurrently measuring the actions of the clinicians. Do they persist with this implementation effort, but also the patient outcomes, which I think is really important. The takeaway from this was that of the 2 studies of the clinicians that were trained, so about 2/3 went on to implement with their patients on their own. And across both studies, CM outperformed standard treatment in terms of engendering longer durations of abstinence. Another message that came through these studies is that we can train clinicians to implement contingency management with fidelity. And another thing that's important to realize is that that competence, that skill tends to decrease without supervision. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to as we move forward with implementation efforts. Another big thing is, like many other behavioral interventions, we found that the clinician's skill in implementing CM and delivering CM is related to patient outcomes. So now let me talk about something that was very, very important to Nancy, and that was the VA implementation effort. This started in 2011 when the VA looked backwards at their data from the entire year of 2010 and realized that only 1% of their veterans with substance use disorders had received contingency management. That was a problem. As you know, the VA, more than a lot of other systems, is very keen on delivering evidence-based treatments, and here's a very effective one that's not reaching their veterans. So in response to that, they issued a memo in 2011 mandating or strongly suggesting that clinicians offer contingency management to their veterans with stimulant disorders. And they backed that up with training, clinician time, and the funds to start their CM programs. In 2012, they were, and we did regional trainings in 2011, training 187 different providers that represented 113 programs across the VA nationally. By summer of 2012, the VA had decided to commit more funding to it, By late 2012, 69% of those initial 113 programs had started implementing CM, so we were off to a good start. And then the VA ran into financial difficulties, which meant that there would possibly not be funds to support continuation of the CM programs. That is where the canteen system stepped into play. So if you're familiar with VAs, they often have little retail shops on site. Those are nonprofits, and they tend to take any profit left over at the end of the year and donate it to clinical services. In this case, they decided that CM programs would be a great place to put those extra funds, and that's what they do. They issue awards yearly, they're competitive, and programs can apply for them. By 2015, we had trained some more programs and more clinicians to implement CM, and 90% of the 129 that had been trained had implemented CM. And by 2018, which is the latest data that I have, 95% of those trained programs have implemented. That's a wild success. Here's some data from the VA. This is as of September 2018. Of those 123 sites that were operational, 92 had sought out those canteen system awards. They had served just under 4,000 veterans and collected more than 50,000 urine samples, of which the vast majority are testing negative. And one of the things that I like about this experience has been the coaching calls that took place and learning from Nancy about those. Nancy did all of these calls, 610 in total. She prioritized these above endless amounts of things, including her daughter had a fairly major illness through her initial bout with breast cancer, and even into the last stages of her second bout when it reoccurred. She prioritized this. She made sure she was there for these things. And the other side of the equation was there too. 75% of them participated in these coaching calls at least yearly, and the mean participation was between 6 and 7 calls by program or each program. So why was the VA a success? Here are my thoughts on that. It certainly doesn't hurt that there was a top-down mandate that the program should be doing this. And there were internal champions. There were leaders within the VA that were really pushing and enthusiastic about CM, and that counts for a lot. They also put their money where their mouth is. They provided monetary support and training to do this. And keep in mind, this was not a research effort. This was a pure clinical effort. There was nothing research about this. And another thing that came out of that I think is interesting is these monthly reports. And this was something that the VA did to spread the word to programs that maybe you hadn't been trained yet or were thinking about implementing CM. And it would include the number of veterans served by these programs, maybe a little bit of outcome, but they also shared personal stories. And that could be clinician stories or patient stories about their experiences with the CM program. And I think those were powerful in terms of engaging new people. Another thing about the coaching that I think is important is that it helps with a lot of things. So it was set up so that these clinics could have pre-implementation consulting and then also post-implementation calls. The pre-implementation phase really helped with working out those problems where programs want to adapt CM to fit their needs or fit the structure of their program, but maybe they go astray a little bit too far. So Nancy could help them dial that back into something that was evidence-based. It also seemed to help a lot with turnover, which we know is an issue in substance use clinics. So as new clinics were coming on board or even new staff were coming on board, they could learn from people who were already doing this and hear from them, which I think is more powerful than hearing from a trainer. So they could hear from the people who are actually doing it, what works and what doesn't work. Another thing that Nancy really pushed were the reminder slips. We do this with our own staff, and it's very simple. It's just a piece of paper that says, what was the outcome today and how many draws did you earn and when are we gonna see you next and how many draws can you earn when we see you then? And that's it. But it serves the purpose of keeping the clinician on track and hitting all of those points that we want to hear in an effective CM session. And so I think it really is critical for keeping people in the range of hitting all of those important points. And you'll occasionally hear patient stories that are really reinforcing, even though they're anecdotal, that they would say something along the lines of, well, I was thinking about using, and then I reached into my pocket, and the slip fell out, and I thought, oh, I can't lose my 10 draws. And those keep you, those are reminders that these things, even minor things like a reminder slip, can be really impactful to patients. And then the other thing that was valuable about the VA experience was the expert involvement, and it was throughout the entire experience, from the design stage to the training stage to the supervision and coaching stage, which was really critical for dealing with issues that come up that are very real to the VA. One example of that is the laboratory turnover times. In the VA, many of the VAs have their own laboratory on site that was processing the urine samples, and most of them took several days to get the results back to the clinic. That is not ideal for CM. You want to reinforce the behavior as close in time as possible. So Nancy was able, through these coaching calls, to really encourage each clinic to negotiate with their laboratory for a rapid turnaround, same-day turnaround. And for those that couldn't do that, she encouraged them to do rapid on-site testing, which many of them did. So moving on to another effort, which I know Nancy was thrilled about, and it's sad to see that she's not here to see it roll out. This is a big project, a randomized cluster trial of 30 sites. All of them are opioid use centers, and right now it is currently, the Wave 1 training is ongoing. We have one more to do, hopefully by the end of the month. And the PIs on this are Sarah Becker from Brown and Brian Gardner from Research Triangle. This is exciting. This is putting it out there. The VA system is a closed system, so that's a little different than clinics. I think this trial, complementing the VA, will be very compelling in terms of moving implementation forward. And different from the VA experience, which the vast majority focus on abstinence reinforcement, Project Mimic is focusing on reinforcing attendance to treatment. So one of the things that Nancy and I are interested in was what happens outside of the research setting. So when people are trying to use rewards clinically, what does it look like? And we did a survey of substance use providers with the goal of answering two major questions: what does this look like? And then secondarily, does training matter? And for the does the training matter question, we looked at the magnitudes of reinforcers that they were using, the immediacy of delivery, how frequently the reinforcement opportunities occurred, and whether or not they included escalation. So these were the reinforcers that they typically used, and the ones highlighted in pink are the ones that you would expect to see in a prize-based contingency management protocol: small tangibles, gift cards, and large tangible items. And you can see the large tangibles are where things fall apart a little bit. What behaviors are they targeting? By and large, it's going to be attendance, and if they do target abstinence, it's going to be multi-drug abstinence. Now, here's the results by training. So let me walk you through these panels. The top two panels did find a significant effect by training. So if you look at the highest magnitude condition there, it was whether or not each patient earned $100 or more over the course of treatment. The dark blue bar are those with more training, and they were much more likely to be in that high magnitude condition. The other thing about that panel I want to draw your attention to is the low magnitude condition, which was the most prevalent condition regardless of training. And that means that most of these programs that are being done clinically out there in the real world without research input are using $25 or less for the entire duration per patient. That is not consistent with what we see in the research literature. The right panel on the top, immediacy of reinforcement, the same effect. Again, you're seeing the large blue bar in the same day delivery, so that's what we want to see, is at least same day or more immediate, and that differ by training conditions. Now, the bottom two panels did not matter whether you had training or not. And I think the frequency of reinforcement may be something that is less modifiable. It may be dictated by clinic schedules or patient schedules, and we may really be in a position of adapting CM to fit that existing schedule. And then the lack of escalation is concerning as well. It doesn't make a difference whether you had training or not, and I hypothesize that that is because they're trying to control costs, so they eliminate the escalation component. But I don't actually know, so we'll see. So what does typical use look like? It looks like reinforcement of treatment attendance, and in terms of parameters, it's low magnitude with delayed reinforcement, lack of escalation, and also concerning is the low frequency. So a third had reinforcement opportunities that occurred less than weekly. That is also not consistent with what we do in research protocols. So CM has a robust evidence for its efficacy. It's really time to push this into the clinical realm, and I can say that I am very sad to not be able to see where Nancy would have gone with this at this later stage of her career. I felt like in this I felt like she really could have done a lot of good here, and it saddens me that she won't be here to see it move forward. We do have robust models for implementation with the VA and soon the Project Mimic results, but keep in mind that both of those projects provided the prizes themselves and also had the training and coaching provision as well. So that is, again, not consistent with what most clinics will be encountering in the real world. They will not have someone giving the prizes to them. They will have to fund them themselves. They will not have someone providing supervision on an ongoing basis. They will have to find that or make that work themselves. Those are things that we need to be thinking about as we move forward in the implementation efforts. And without those inputs, without funding the prizes, without providing supervision, we are going to see that typical use veers away from evidence-based practices. I was a mentee of Nancy and respected her greatly. She was an incredible scientist. And I hope that Sheila, Leslie, Kristen Zajac, and I can honor her legacy by continuing the lab forward. I do want to acknowledge our funding from NIH and from SAMHSA, and I'm going to highlight that we have a T32 with an open slot, so please send people our way. And I think we're going to save questions to the end. Thank you.
And now for our last but surely not least speaker, we'll hear from Nancy's colleague David Ledgerwood from Wayne State, who'll talk about some of the work she got into later in applying behavior analysis to understand and treating disordered gambling.
Thank you. All right. How do we get us going here? Just,
There.
oh, all right. Hi, everybody. I'm.
You don't want to put that down.
You want it up? Okay. I think it was still high from when John was up here, and he's really, really tall, and I'm really, really not. I'm so honored to be here to talk about my work with Nancy and to hear about other people's work with Nancy. I came, I think, a lot like Carla did, to work with Nancy, and she was my mentor sort of after graduate school. Like Carla mentioned, Nancy was not all that much older than either of us. I think she's probably about 3 years older than me. But by the time I sort of graduated with my PhD and came to work with Nancy, she had probably already had about 100 publications at that point, which is really quite intimidating. My first memory of speaking with Nancy was I was on internship, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do next, and I had done a little bit of work on both contingency management and gambling, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's someone who's actually right up the road who's done both of these things, and she's done a phenomenal amount of work. So I just called her one day, and within about 3 days, I was sitting in her office, talking to her about the possibility of working with her as a postdoc. And that was sort of my first experience with her, and sort of struck me at that point just what an amazing person she is, because she looks at people and she'll look at what you're interested in and what you're about, and she'll give you a chance. And she gave so many people a chance, and I think that's why she's had so many great colleagues and so many great mentees over the year, because she's helped make those people what they were, and she certainly did that for me. Now, what was also interesting is a couple of months later, when I was actually working there, I accidentally found out that she reviewed my one paper on gambling. I found a file where she had my comments. I remember it being a very sort of fair but tough review. That sort of led me down the road, sort of talk to her about mentorship, and it sort of led me to this one speech that I give to all of the students who work with me now. It's like, no matter what, whatever you put on paper, make sure you get it to me. You're going to get it back, and there's going to be red everywhere. But don't worry about that, because that's just the first step. We get that to the next step, and the next step, you're not expected to know what you're doing until you've done it for a few times. And for me, that those memories just really stick with me, but the other thing that really sticks with me is her sense of humor. On my very last day there, and she was not very happy that I was leaving to go back to Michigan. She was not. And yet, so she gave me this going away packet that had a variety of things, you know, like a Yukon t-shirt and a whole bunch of other stuff. And among the things that were in the packet was also a dollar store set of poker chips, a set of gigantic playing cards, and a 40-ounce bottle of really cheap beer. So, you know, I always remember that. I think I still have the playing cards, and I've never opened the box and just kept them for all that time. But I want to talk today about her work in gambling, and I want to talk a little bit, not just about behavior analysis. No disclosures to talk about today. John mentioned her book, Pathological Gambling, which is the photo in the middle. This book was published in 2005, and it's still regarded as probably the most comprehensive book on gambling disorder out there right now, which is, one, a huge testament to Nancy, but also, unfortunately, speaks to the void in the field right now in problem gambling, because Nancy's not there doing this work, which is unfortunate. But she, you know, if you look at it this way, she's done all this work in discounting and contingency management and implementation science, and she was probably the top person in the world in the field of gambling disorder. How does one person do all of that? I mean, that's just amazing, right? So I'm going to talk about three key areas that I think were, at least in my mind, are the three main areas that I think Nancy had a pretty huge influence on in the gambling disorder field. Development of the DSM-5 gambling disorder criteria, her work on cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing treatments, and also her work on discounting and impulsivity as mechanisms of gambling disorder, and sort of how these might be sort of connected, and hopefully a few thoughts about where we can sort of go with these at this point. But first of all, a lot of people know that when DSM-5 was being developed, Nancy was actually the chair of the subcommittee for non-substance behavioral addictions. And so she essentially had a lot of sway on what we, you know, how we now conceive of gambling disorder. For those of you, because we don't talk about gambling disorder very much at this meeting, for those of you who don't know, gambling disorder has been a disorder in the DSM since about the 1980s. It started in DSM-3. In DSM-4, it was included as an impulse control disorder not elsewhere classified. And over the course of many decades, probably about 3 or 4 decades, there was this huge and ever-growing literature showing that gambling disorder had a lot of characteristics that were really quite similar to substance use disorders, like cocaine use disorder and other substance use disorders. So Nancy, as I mentioned, was the chair of the subcommittee on behavioral addictions. And so in terms of she had a lot to work with. First of all, I'm not going to go through all the diagnostic criteria for what used to be called pathological gambling. So, I mean, think about the terminology has changed now from pathological as sort of derogatory moniker to what we call gambling disorder. But there were 10 criteria, essentially. During the course of her time and sort of looking at the work that her and a lot of people did, they were actually able to get the criteria down to 9 instead of 10 by dropping this number 8 criteria right here, engaging in illegal activities to finance gambling. And the reason that that criteria was dropped was, one, that it was the least frequently endorsed criteria for gambling disorder at about 20 to 25%. And also, you really couldn't have you really couldn't get that criteria and not have a diagnosis of gambling disorder already. So if you had 5 out of 10, if you had fewer than 5 out of 10 symptoms, the likelihood that you were engaging in illegal activity to support your gambling was really, really quite low. So that was one of the things that she was able to do in terms of streamlining the diagnosis. Now, she and a number of other people, but she in particular wrote a number of papers and were involved in quite a bit of research leading up to DSM-5 that focused on the scope, essentially, of addictive behaviors. And the big question was, should we be including behavioral addictions along with substance use disorders in the DSM? And there were a lot of reasons to do that in terms of similar personality characteristics, similar biochemistry, similar treatments. A lot of the treatments were based on treatments for substance use disorder, including Dr. Carroll's work on CBT for cocaine dependence, and 12-step approaches, and also motivational interviewing approaches. And throughout this process, I think she was really instrumental in really steering the field of gambling disorder to where we are now, and the criteria for gambling disorder to where we are now. And so as of DSM-5, gambling disorder is no longer considered an impulse control disorder along with hair pulling and fire setting and intermittent explosive disorder, but rather it's a disorder that's alongside the substance use disorder. So it's now considered an addiction in the DSM-5 in the substance-related and addictive disorders section, and also to be somewhat more consistent with the criteria of substance use disorder. Now, instead of 5 out of 10 criteria for diagnosis, you need 4 out of 9. Which is somewhat similar to the 3 you'd need for a substance use disorder. It's closer anyway. So what I think informed her work that sort of really got her to think about gambling disorder as an addictive disorder really stemmed from a couple of decades of work that I actually really got to sort of work on with her and was able to really sort of benefit from in terms of learning how to do clinical trials and how to understand how to develop really good treatment studies. In her work sort of throughout the 90s and early 2000s, developing treatments for gambling disorder. And as I mentioned that, a lot of those treatments were based on treatments from substance use disorder. And so in the early 2000s, she actually conducted probably one of the most rigorous trials in the field of gambling disorder, focused on sort of the efficacy of cognitive behavioral treatments for gambling disorder. Prior to this study, there were several trials on gambling disorder, but many of them had a lot of problems. So there was a huge dropout throughout treatment. There was a huge dropout from the studies, and so oftentimes there wasn't an ability to really sort of get follow-up data on people who had disappeared, dropped out of treatment. Nancy, one of the things that she really introduced was this idea of using an intent to treat analysis, which we use in many of our clinical trials now. But in the gambling disorder field, people really weren't doing that, this idea of following up with people even if they dropped out of treatment. So to do that, you had to have an extremely thorough assessment of a person, get as much information as you could, get phone numbers, get addresses and phone numbers of people who know the participant in the study. Just the rigor in the field just jumped up 12 notches when Nancy started doing clinical trials on gambling disorder, because she was the only one in the field who was really doing that at the time. So in this particular study, which is also the largest trial at the time, she recruited 231 pathological gamblers, and she randomized these folks to one of 3 treatment conditions. So Gamblers Anonymous referral, so essentially these folks had an assessment and then they were referred to Gamblers Anonymous meetings in the area. A Gamblers Anonymous referral plus a 8-chapter cognitive behavior therapy workbook that basically used the cognitive behavior therapy but in a sort of a self-administered workbook form. And Gamblers Anonymous referral plus 8 sessions of individual face-to-face cognitive behavior therapy. And this was where I personally got my first real exposure to people who had gambling problems. These folks are incredibly fascinating people to work with. They're not all the same, obviously, but to work with problem gamblers, they come in with some of the most interesting problems and interesting lives and interesting personalities that I think I've ever seen. And that I've seen with a lot of people as I've gone forward and continued to work with people with gambling problems. The outcomes were measured at 1 month, post-treatment, 6 months, and 12 months, and included the South Oaks Gambling Screen, which was a measure of problem gambling severity, which was consistent with DSM-3R criteria for gambling disorder. The Addiction Severity Index Gambling gambling screen, number of days gambled, and dollars gambled in the past month. So this, at the time, some of these measures are kind of older. We don't use some of these, but it really sort of set the standard for many, many years as to what measures we would use to measure gambling disorder. Now, this slide shows essentially the four sort of outcome graphs here. It's a little bit small, but I think you can sort of see, the open circles were the folks who just received the Gamblers Anonymous referral. The dark triangles were the CBT workbook, and the diamonds, the colored in diamonds, were the CBT therapy. And across all four of those outcomes, we see that the people who received the individual face-to-face one-on-one therapy had the best outcomes among all three groups. So in this particular study, as Carla was mentioning with the contingency management work, we spent hours and hours going through recorded sessions of cognitive behavior therapy. We were using the Yale Adherence Competency Scale, and we would sit down with our therapists and nitpick like every little thing. Like, you didn't do this right, you did this good, you didn't do that well. It's like, well, next time you should do more of this. So we knew we were doing good, I think, cognitive behavior therapy at that time. And that was just great. I'd go to Nancy and I'd say, I think we might have made one of the therapists cry today. And she would be like, oh, okay, well, let's ease off them let's give them a little bit of a break for a while. Just that sort of attention to detail, we had, I think it sort of really stands out. I don't think anybody's really doing that in the gambling field at this time. Nancy also had a series of treatment studies that focused on brief interventions for gambling disorder, and the main sort of impetus for this was that there are a lot of problem gamblers out there who will not on their own go to treatment. Actually, a lot like alcohol use disorders, only about 1 in 10 people with a gambling problem will ever seek treatment for their gambling disorder. And so what Nancy was interested in is, well, how can we get people who either had sort of sub-threshold gambling problems, so they didn't quite meet diagnostic criteria for gambling disorder, or people who had gambling disorder but they wouldn't go to treatment. How do we get them some level of care? And she did a series of 3 studies. I'm going to talk in depth about one of them. The first one that I was privileged to be involved with focused on people who were actually recruited from among community dental clinics and medical clinics in Connecticut, and we had 180 problem gamblers recruited, and they were randomized to one of 4 treatment conditions. The first was just an assessment-only condition, so those people basically had an assessment of their gambling problem and were sent on their way. 10 minutes of brief advice. So essentially, we would give them some information about gambling problems and give them advice to reduce their gambling problems or stop gambling altogether, depending on what was going on with them. 50 minutes of motivational enhancement therapy, which is a structured therapy that's based on MI, essentially, or a 4-session therapy that involved the 50-minute motivational enhancement therapy, along with 3 50-minute cognitive behavior therapy sessions. And so we followed these people out at 1 month post intake and 9 months post intake, and we looked at their treatment attendance, we looked at their addiction severity index gambling score, and the amount of money that they wagered gambling. And just here's some characteristics. They basically had about on average 5 diagnostic symptoms on what's called the NODS. Basically, it's a DSM-4 based measure of gambling disorder. So at the time we were doing this study, 5 was the cutoff for pathological gambling, and so on average, our average participant actually just barely met diagnostic criteria for gambling disorder. They had higher scores on the South Oaks gambling screen. They were gambling about $300 to $500 a month, and they're mostly gambling on scratch cards and lottos, slot machines, and cards. And we were really interested to see, because these folks really weren't interested in treatment, would they come to treatment? Would they come to these counseling sessions? And what we found was that they would, and we had 100% attendance for the brief advice condition. We had almost 95% for the first motivational enhancement condition. In the MET-only condition, about 87.5 in the MET-CBT condition. And as you see in the MET-CBT condition, our attendance did drop off a little bit to the point where in session 4, about a third of our participants actually attended that 4th session. But if you think about this fact that these folks are not getting any treatment anywhere, this is actually not bad. We got a third of our sample in that condition to go to four treatment sessions. In terms of the outcomes, we got some outcomes we really weren't expecting. We weren't expecting, for example, the brief advice condition to actually do somewhat better than the MET and the CBT conditions, which wasn't statistically significant, but it was a little bit of a shocker to us. And we have a few theories about why that might be. You can see that the MET-CBT folks did a little bit better. Lower scores is better here at the 9-month follow-up. And similarly, when we looked at number of, amount of money wagered, so mean dollars gambled, transformed, we see here that the brief advice condition actually did best. Now, there were 2 other studies that were sort of in this series of studies. One was done with the exact same protocol, but with college students. And in that case, we actually got better results for the MET and CBT conditions. And then the other one was done by Carla and Sheila Alessi, along with Nancy, with substance abusing participants. We also found that those problem gamblers actually did a little bit better with MET and CBT as well. And so the implications here, I think, Nancy's treatment work, particularly her work with cognitive behavior therapy, but also motivational enhancement approaches in these brief approaches, were really not only the most rigorous studies of their time in the gambling disorder field, but really there's nothing that's come along since then that's been better in many respects. This work came from the substance abuse literature. It came from models of treatment that we use in substance abuse, and I think it was one of the big factors that really led us to, I think, really believe that gambling disorder is an addiction like the substance use disorders. And it provided a foundation for much of the treatment research that followed in the gambling field. And as I said, without Nancy in that field, there's been a little bit of a gap there. We need another Nancy to really follow this through, right? Now, the last thing I'm going to sort of touch on before I end is I think a little bit to follow up on Warren's talk this morning in terms of mechanisms, and I think it ties it a little bit together, focusing a little bit on delayed discounting. Now, you guys have already heard what delayed discounting is. I couldn't explain it better than Warren, and I won't try. But I mean, just this idea of a temporal delay between the present and the receipt of a reward. The subjective value of that reward decreases as the delay gets longer. So as the time until delivery of a reward increases, most people will shift towards accepting a smaller, more immediate reward over a larger delayed reward. So we're talking about monetary sort of time-based delayed discounting. Now, I think this might have been the study Warren might have already talked about. Petrie and Casarella actually did this. One of the first studies published in 1999 in drug and alcohol dependence, where she recruited substance users with and without pathological gambling. And so she had 29 substance users with pathological gambling and 34 without, and compared them to control participants on their response to 2 delayed discounting tasks. One was a task that involved dollar amounts ranging from $1 to $1,000, and the other one was sort of $1 to $100 in hypothetical rewards over a delay period of 6 hours to 25 years. And as you can see in this first graph, there's a pretty large difference between the substance users with and without gambling problems and control participants. So both groups of substance users actually discounted delayed rewards at significantly steeper rates than did control participants. But in this particular analysis, there was also a difference between substance users with and without co-occurring pathological gambling. So we see that there's an additive effect of pathological gambling in terms of well, impulsivity, if we want to call delayed discounting impulsivity, that those folks tend to be more impulsive than do people who have substance use disorders without gambling problems. Similarly, here, you're looking at the $1 to $100 hypothetical reward. In this case, we see that the substance users with and without gambling problems discount delayed rewards at much steeper rates than do healthy control participants. In this case, we're not seeing a difference between those with and without gambling problems. And then a second study that I'll sort of just talk about very briefly focused on problem gamblers, so flipped it a little bit, focused on problem gamblers with and without substance use disorders compared to healthy control participants, and in this case used the $1 to $1,000 hypothetical monetary amount. And what Nancy found here was that, not surprisingly, those people who are problem gamblers tended to discount delayed rewards at a much steeper rate than did individuals who are healthy controls. And there was a significant difference between problem gamblers with and without histories of substance use disorder. There were a number of other studies, and I'm not going to go through these in too much detail, but she's conducted a number of other studies looking at discounting delayed rewards and found some varying results. For example, Andrade and Petrie actually found problem gamblers with a substance use disorder history had higher discounting rates than gamblers without such a history. I worked with Nancy and found no differences between gamblers with and without substance use histories. Sheila Alessi had a really great study where she found that among problem gamblers, gambling severity is a significant predictor of discounting, even after taking into account factors like age, gender, education, substance use treatment history, and cigarette smoking. So Nancy really has this long history of working not just in developing, sort of what gambling disorder is and developing treatments, but also understanding some of the underlying mechanism, in this case, discounting delayed rewards. And if I step back, because I feel like I've done this talk in some ways backwards, sort of starting with the DSM, then going to the treatment, and then going to mechanisms, I think there are pretty big implications here for what gambling disorder is, right? So impulsivity and discounting are characteristics that we clearly see in both people with substance use disorders and with gambling problems. The evidence-based treatments for gambling disorder are really similar to those for substance use disorder and actually come from the substance abuse literature. There are numerous other, I think, characteristics that are shared between the substance use disorders and gambling disorder. I think what this helps us to understand is our treatments, even though we have some effective treatments, they're probably insufficient for really helping a lot of problem gamblers. Because I think as Warren's talk really sort of highlighted, he put up the slide of people generally think ahead a long time, but people with heroin problems think ahead like 9 days. The same is true with people with gambling problems. And so if we're doing something like cognitive behavior therapy, where the idea is to set up goals and to think about what are you going to do in the future, a lot of people with gambling problems are going to be incapable of doing that. We've actually got some really great results with treatment for gambling problems, but ultimately I think we're going to have to come up with additional treatments or other ways of sort of dealing with this discounting piece. Right? I see the red light just went on, so I'm just in time for my conclusion slide. So just to sum up, Nancy's work demonstrates I think a potential path forward for understanding gambling disorder, for understanding substance abuse treatment as well, and how these things actually are similar, and the types of things that we really need to sort of address to make these treatments more effective, and specifically looking at this sort of idea of discounting and I think Warren's work that he's started is a huge step forward in this. And hopefully we can apply it to gambling disorder as well as substance use disorder. But I think that ultimately that's the legacy of Nancy's work, is to set us up at this point so that now we have all the pieces and we just have to put them together and move forward to say, okay, so how do we improve this? I think it's the same with the contingency management part as well. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
I want to thank the speakers for presenting 4 incredible talks, and I hope and trust that these talks captured the work of this amazing, amazing woman. This is all, you know, her passing is still raw for us. It didn't happen very long ago. So those of us who worked with her are really feeling very sad at this time. And I just, you know, I wrote down just some words as I was listening to characterize Nancy's contribution, you know, as the innovator, the teacher, the scholar, the creative and rigorous researcher, communicator, salesperson. You know, her fresh insights into delay discounting were a great start. Her innovations in contingency management that made them ever so much more attractive to clinicians, you know, not necessarily more effective than what had gone before, but more attractive to clinicians. And this was one part of her genius, was being able to relate to the clinicians. And I even have a story of, and then finally the recasting of gambling as an impulsive disorder, which kind of closes the circle and brings it back to delay discounting. It's such a beautiful story. It just really is. Her ability to communicate with clinicians was something I saw when we worked in the CTN, and as I said this morning, it was one of the joys of CTN to co-lead that study, the multi-site study with Nancy. You know, she just said, CM is just the most natural and fun thing you could do. And the clinicians are going grumbling, you know, oh, we really have to do that, you know, oh, they're all going to gamble and they're going to relapse, they're going to use their money to relapse and all this. And so what did she do? She brought in a patient to our meeting. She brought in this very wonderful, attractive man, and African-American man, and handsome he was, I remember. And he started talking to that group of clinicians and told them, yeah, he said, when I first started Nancy's program, I was doing it for the money. But then I saw how much better my life was when I was free of drugs, when I was abstinent from the drugs, and pretty soon I started doing it for myself. Well, that story just grabbed, you know, the clinicians where they live, and this was the kind of thing that she could do. It was brilliant. And the other thing is, I hope that you get the picture about her legendary productivity. What was it, 368 papers? More than that, 390 something? Close to 400 papers in, you know, she was promoted to professor in 6 years, 400 papers. You can imagine what a joy it was to write with Nancy, give her some data, and she had a paper written the next day, and her writing was clear, it was succinct, it was just a joy to work with her. So, her passion for dissemination, I think, came through the fact that she did it in a rigorous way and an effective way, leading the VA study. I mean, the amount that she did, it reminds me of Mozart or something, you know, having this creative genius who gets cut down early in life by the ravages of a disease. It's just the saddest thing. But the good news is that her contributions are legendary. She was a powerhouse, and we're going to miss her a lot, but her legacy will definitely live on. So now I'm going to turn over to Kathy, who's going to give her comments as a discussant.
I just want to thank everyone for being here. I know there's many of Nancy's teachers and mentors and friends and research assistants who are here, and I know she touched us all in so many ways. And I thank the speakers. It was just, you know, she died at 49. So she's never going to get a Festschrift. She's never going to get that. So I'm glad that we were able to do this today, and I was happy that at the memorial, John and Max and I cooked it up, and it went so well, and thank you all. So you've got a bit of a glimpse at this extraordinary woman, and she had so much more work to do and so much more life to enjoy. We haven't touched on some of the stuff that she's done. On top of all this other stuff and all this productivity. I mean, if she was doing 368 or 370 now, she would have been about 1,000 manuscripts by the time she was done. I mean, can you imagine where it would have...
Book of Records.
I know. I mean, just imagine. But you know, while she was doing that, she also was editor of Psychology of Addictive Behavior. Before that, she was a specialty editor for addiction. I mean, there were just 100 other things, 100 people that she mentored. So I want to thank the program committee for this. You know, she also has now ruined CPDD for me forever. Because she had little kids and I had little kids and we had complicated, busy lives. We were mostly phone friends. And so, because we used to call each other Mrs. Dr. White, because we both happened to be married to Miss Dr. Whites. And, you know, so at CPDD last year in San Diego, she called me, Mrs. Dr. White, I've got stage 4 breast cancer and it's come back. And it's going to go soon. And it ruined CPDD for the rest of me. I'm still stunned. I'm not going to stop being stunned. And by July 17th, she was gone. I mean, there was no time. There were a couple calls in there, and every time I called her, she was sick, but she was still working. Up to the end, it was just absolutely extraordinary. She was part of the center that Bruce Rounsaville and I had for 20 years. And I mean, it was just, I'm going to get to the good part. But we've said all this about her scientific achievements, but they are nothing compared to the woman that this lady was. She was one of my best friends. She was there at the hardest times. Did you have the slides of the kids? She was a fiercely protective mother to beautiful Hannah and Noah, who for some reason wouldn't speak to me no matter how much she reinforced that. When I would come over. Can you imagine, Hannah, as Carla mentioned, had very severe diabetes from an early age. And all of Nancy's energy and passion, which are formidable, turned on to taking care of that kid and keeping her alive in extraordinary ways. And I think, you know, the other thing we haven't talked about is how she changed diabetes treatment for pediatric diabetes treatment in Connecticut, and that's part of her legacy too. She was also the most fun and operationally informed mother I've ever seen. So she would also come to center meetings all the time, and she'd have Hannah running around and stuff like that. But then every time Hannah was just like coming over and do something, she'd like throw a little treat at her and everything. And this kid was just beautiful. She was a formidable and loving partner to William White, who will never be the same. She was a fast and loyal friend to so many of us here, and I think it is true that we can only honor her by continuing her extremely incredible work. You know, she was a wicked friend, I'm just trying to talk about her extraordinary laugh. That wicked cackle that wouldn't stop. It's echoing for all of us. And so, you know, we were talking about this. We could have questions. But we thought it'd be much more appropriate to maybe at the end of this, maybe go down to the bar. Those of you who knew and admired and loved Nancy, go down to the Crooked Branch Bar. We'll kind of go on that side to the left. And then we can share stories that aren't so appropriate for a festschrift about this really extraordinary woman who we all love and miss so very much. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye. Are there questions?
I mean, are there people who would like to share memories or ask reflections or ask anything from the speakers? Because if not, we're just going to go to the bar.
And tell Nancy stories.
And tell Nancy stories.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
I'm glad we did that. I know. You stay around for